Hey guys, welcome back to Release the Craftin. Priscilla here with another episode of Storycraft. And you guys, it's the 1st of November, as of the airing of this recording, not when you're watching it particularly. But you know what that means? It means that we're officially in Poevember. And that's right. I'm going to read you guys some Poe stories all this month because I'm taking some time off and, compiling stories does get a little bit stressful and worky. So instead of doing that, I'm just going to read you some of my favorite little short stories from Edgar Allan Poe, who's one of my favorite, classic authors. So I'm excited. I think this is going to be really fun. I love these stories. I know a lot of you do too as well. So I know that you're looking forward to it, and I am just happy to bring it to you here while we make some crafts and continue the spooky season even after Halloween is over. So, without further ado, I am reading to you The Masque of the Red Death because I love it, and I also feel like it's a little bit more timely than it used to be to me when I first read it. But I think you guys will enjoy it if you haven't heard it already. If you have heard it, I hope that I do it justice when I read it. I don't know what else to say about that. I don't know where that thought was going, but I guess I can just sprinkle in that this story originally was published in 1842, which is interestingly only 7 years before Poe dies. If you remember in my last episode about Poe, he only lived for 40 years and was so prolific in that time and didn't get to see the majority of his success, which is truly tragic because he didn't become famous until way after, a little bit like Van Gogh did. And yeah, it's just kind of crazy to me that this story is so close to his death. Not that his life was particularly very long, but in the scheme of things, this one came up pretty close to that. And yeah, that's really all I have to say about that. So let's get into The Masque of the Red Death. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar, and it sealed the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores, with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow man. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress or egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all of the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these and security were within, without the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first, let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7 an imperial suite. Many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bazaar. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor, which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. The seventh apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceilings and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro or depended from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers, but in the corridors that followed the suite, there stood, opposite to each window, a heavy tripod bearing a brazier of fire that protected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illumined the room. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effects of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered, that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang, and when the minute hand made the circuit of the face and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of an hour, the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound, and thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company, and while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows, as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows, each to each other, that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embraced 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then were the same disconcert and the tremulousness and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of the 7 chambers upon occasion of this great feat, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to their masqueraders. Be sure they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm, much of what has been since seen in Hernani, and there were arabesque figures with unsweeted limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies such as the madman fashions. There was much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the 7 chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams. And these the dreams writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms, and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps. And, anon, there strikes the ebony clock, which stands in the hall of the velvet, and then, for a moment, all is still, and all is silent, save the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells, and the dreams live and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many-tinted windows through which the stream of the rays from the tripods. But to the chamber which lies most westwardly of the seven, there are now none of the maskers who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appalls, and to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet, there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal more solemnly emphatic than any which reaches their ears who indulge in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life, and the revel went whirlingly on, until at length there were commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock, and then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened, perhaps, that more of the thought crept, with more of time, into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who revelled, and thus, too, it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz or murmur expressive of disapprobation and surprise, then finally of terror, of horror, and of disgust. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such a sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod, and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the hearts of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion. Even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally jest, there are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny might have had difficulty in detecting the cheat. And yet all this might have been endured, if not approved, by the mad revellers around, but the murmur had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet horror. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, which, with a slow and solemn movement, as if to fully sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed, in the first moment with a strong shudder either of terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares," he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him, "who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand, and now, with deliberately and stately step, made a closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the mummer had inspired the whole party, there were found none who put forth hand to seize him, so that unimpeded he passed within a yard of the prince's person, and while the vast assembly, as if with no impulse, shrank from the centres of the rooms to the walls, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached in rapid I don't know how to say that, in rapid impetuosity, to within 3 or 4 of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped, gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterwards fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and the corpse-like mask which they had handled with so violent a rudeness, untenanted by any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. And that is the end of the story. And you guys, I guess some apologies are in order because I totally broke character because I was stumped by that word. So that may have thrown out some of the tension of the final moments of the story. Also, I wanted to mention it up top, but forgot. So I thought about it the entire time I read the story. But this reading is a little bit lower energy than they normally are. And I am feeling a little bit lower energy than I normally do because of allergies and general chronic sicknesses and stuff like that. So apologies for that as well. It's part of the reason that I am taking the break and reading stories instead of making up my own because I'm tired and I needed to take a break. So yeah, apologies for the lower energy read. Hopefully the next one will be a bit higher energy. I'll sleep a bit more. Try to do that before I record. But yeah, this is the story. I just wanted to say that, and I thought about it the entire time I was reading, which did not make it easier to read. So at any rate, I really enjoyed this story, and when I first read it, I was like, ooh, spooky, like death came and ruined this whole party. But now, as an older person, because I probably read this when I was in high school, so as an older adult person who has lived through the entirety of the pandemic, this story hits especially hard now because it's basically just the wealthy elite secluding themselves in their fancy palaces and having this big old fantastic orgy of a party while everybody else is suffering and dying from the plague because this prince doesn't want to confront the fact that there's an epidemic. And it turns out that you can't actually get away from death. And I think the theme, or the reoccurring nature of this theme, really sort of drives home how terrifying the story is for me, I guess, because a lot of attention is paid to that clock that's in the black chamber, which is the only chamber that has red windows and black furnishings, and it doesn't match, and nobody knows why. That's never explained. So you just have to think about that because every other room matches. So if the window is orange, all the stuff in the room is orange. But for some reason, when Prince Prospero was putting this together, he made everything in the room black, but then was like, what if the window was red, y'all? And they just did that, and they went with that instead of just, making a red room, which I guess if you're calling your plague the Red Death, you wouldn't make a red room, but then why have red stained glass windows? It doesn't make sense. At any rate, the clock in there continues to chime, and every time it chimes, it's so loud that everybody stops. Everything they're doing, the music stops, the party stops, everyone just stops to listen to the clock chime. And then when it goes on again, the clock goes off, they just go right back to their party and their revelry. And I think it's just a really poignant, but also bit of clever literature there, to have it as you cannot escape time. You might think that you're safe from the disease behind these walls, but you can't get away from time. And eventually something is going to happen and you're going to have to confront that. And they can't get away from it, even though they try to ignore it. And they keep telling themselves oh, well, I'll just ignore time. I'll just ignore impending death. The next time, but when they are confronted with it again, when the clock chimes again, they have to then confront that feeling again, and it makes everybody uncomfortable, but nobody says anything. And it's kind of this twofold story about the fear of death and the fear of disease, and that on top of also the fear of finality and reality and having to confront those issues, because you can't run away from your problems, and you can pretend like they're not there, but you can't do that successfully because they have a way of creeping back up. So I think this is a really good story. It's, I think, one of the better examples of how Poe uses repetition in his stories to sort of drive home points and themes that he's trying to get across. Because, we talked about that clock a lot. We talked about the rooms a lot. Stuff came around over and over again. There's sort of a overindulgence in the exaggeration of like how many times things are said in his writing that I really appreciate, because I think it really sort of drives home like stuff that you need to pay attention to, but also like it's just a really clever bit of wordplay to get a point across, especially without exposition. And there's very little dialogue in this story as opposed to like the Cask of Amontillado, where there was a lot of talking. This one is mostly just description of the setting. And I think, we can all sort of recall being in similar situations, having survived through the pandemic and seeing how people with means managed to, sort of endure while the rest of us had to struggle on the front lines, kind of stuff like that. So I think there's a lot there that makes it a lot more timely and relevant for me than it was when I first read it. So I really enjoy that story. Also, I am obsessed with The Fall of the House of Usher. The story itself, but also the Netflix show was really, really good. And this was like one of the first episodes. They did the Masque of the Red Death, and I was like, this is amazing. So I had to read it for this because I loved that episode, and the whole show was great. I loved it. But yeah, that's it for me, guys. I hope that you enjoyed this one. And if you have any thoughts or feelings about this, if you have something similar here, if you've seen the show, I would love to talk to you about it. So you can leave it in the comments below, and I will catch up with you then. If you made it to the end of the video, I appreciate your faces, and I'll catch you guys all in the next one. Till then, happy crafting. Bye.